My son-in-law laughed when I sat down at the negotiating table. Then the CEO stood up and said, "Wait, is that who I think it is?" The entire room shifted. They had no idea who they were dealing with until... The laugh was quiet. That's what I remember most. Not loud, not theatrical, just a soft exhale through the nose, the kind of laugh that says you're not even worth the energy of a full reaction. Darnell Wicks, my daughter's husband of 4 years, leaned back in his chair at the far end of the Valthorn Capital conference table and looked at me the way a man looks at something he finds mildly inconvenient rather than genuinely threatening. Then he turned to his attorney, murmured something I couldn't hear, and they both glanced at me again with the specific coordinated dismissal of two people who have already decided how a meeting will end before it has begun. I was 63 years old, wearing a gray blazer I'd bought off a rack, carrying a folder I'd assembled myself, and I had just sat down across from a man who had spent the past 14 months systematically attempting to strip my daughter of everything she owned. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. The CEO of Valthorn Capital, a man named Reginald Thorpe, had not yet entered the room. When the door opened 30 seconds later and Thorpe walked in and saw me sitting there, he stopped walking. Completely stopped. He looked at me for 3 full seconds, and then he said slowly, in the voice of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the next 2 hours, "Wait, is that who I think it is?" The room shifted like a deck of cards being reorganized by someone who suddenly understood the game. I'd been retired for 2 years when Imani called me from her car at 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday in September. I knew it was serious because Imani didn't call late. She texted, like everyone under 40, and when she did call, it was for logistics, pickup times, recipe questions, whether I'd gotten her message. A late call meant something had broken. I answered on the second ring, and she was crying before she said a word. The specific crying of someone who has been holding it together for a long time and has finally reached a private enough moment to let go. She told me about the accounts. She told me that Darnell had moved $340,000 out of their joint investment account into an account she couldn't access, and had then, apparently, begun the process of consulting a divorce attorney. A process she'd discovered not because he told her, but because she'd found a receipt for a consultation fee from a firm called Acker and Brandt in the pocket of a jacket she was taking to the dry cleaner. She hadn't confronted him yet. She was still in the parking lot of a grocery store, 3 blocks from the house they shared, unable to go inside. "Dad," she said, "what do I do?" I told her to stay in the car. I told her I was going to make some calls. I told her she wasn't alone in this. And then I sat in my kitchen at midnight and thought about Darnell Wicks, who had always smiled a half-second too late, and about the specific quality of his courtesy toward me. Always surface correct, I always somehow condescending beneath the surface. And I thought, this is going to require everything I used to know how to do. My name is Walter Adeyemi Burgess. I spent 31 years in corporate finance, the last 12 as a managing partner at a private equity firm called Gray Ridge Capital, before I sold my stake and retired at 61 with enough to live comfortably and enough relationships to fill 3 Rolodexes, which is a reference that will date me, but that I'll stand behind. I'm not a flashy man. I drive a sensible car, I wear sensible clothes, and I have never in my life felt the need to walk into a room and announce what I was capable of. My wife, Adaisy, who passed 6 years ago from ovarian cancer, and who was smarter than anyone I've ever met in finance or elsewhere, used to say that I was the most dangerous kind of person in any negotiation, the kind that nobody sees coming. I'd taken that as the compliment she intended and tried to live up to it. When I retired, I had genuinely intended to garden, to read, to visit Imani and Darnell regularly for dinners that I would cook and they would eat, to watch my daughter build the life she'd worked for. Darnell had other plans, apparently. Plans that did not include my daughter keeping what she'd earned, and plans that certainly did not include her father sitting across from him at a negotiating table with anything resembling leverage. He had miscalculated on both counts. Badly. The first thing I did the morning after Imani's call was contact an attorney named Lorraine Obie, a family law specialist I'd been referred to by a former colleague who described her as the best divorce litigator in Atlanta. Full stop. No qualifier. Lorraine had been practicing for 26 years, was a former Fulton County family court clerk who understood the procedural landscape from the inside and had a reputation for being methodical and merciless in equal measure. I reached her at 8:15 a.m. She asked me to come in that afternoon. I drove to her office in Midtown with the folder I'd already started building. Imani's account statements showing the balance before and after the transfer, A timeline of the past 3 months I'd reconstructed from things Imani had mentioned over dinners and calls, and a single screenshot Imani had sent me of the dry cleaning receipt, which was not legally significant, but which felt like the kind of detail that mattered. When Lorraine reviewed everything in 20 minutes, asked precise questions, and then said, "Your daughter needs to file a complaint with the court for dissipation of marital assets before he moves anything else. We do that today, or the $340,000 gets further away every hour." She also said, looking at me with the directness I would come to appreciate, "You seem like someone who knows people. In this situation, that's either going to help or complicate things, depending on how you use it. Ani, be careful." I told her I was always careful. She looked at me like she wasn't entirely sure she believed that, but was willing to wait and see. The second call I made was to a financial investigator named Kofi Mensah, who had spent 14 years at the SEC before going private, and who specialized in tracing the movement of money through complex account structures. I'd known Kofi professionally for nearly a decade, back when Grayridge had used his firm during a due diligence process on a troubled acquisition. He was thorough, quiet, and had the particular gift of being able to explain complicated financial forensics to non-specialists without condescension. I retained him personally. This was my cost, not Imani's, and gave him everything I had. He told me he'd start with the destination account for the $340,000 and work outward. "If he's been planning this for a while," Kofi said in the flat, in the observational tone he used for everything, "there'll be earlier movements. People who do this once usually did it before, quietly, to test the infrastructure." He was right, as I'd suspected he would be. The earlier movements would take 3 weeks to fully document, but they told a story that was considerably uglier than a single transferred sum. The first red flag I personally remembered looking backward was from 18 months before the late night call. Darnell had come to Sunday dinner at my house, a regular event, every other Sunday, Imani's idea and one I'd always valued, and mentioned almost in passing that he was thinking of restructuring the way he and Imani held their joint assets, that some investment advisor had recommended separating certain accounts for tax efficiency. I'd asked a few questions. Darnell had deflected with the ease of someone who found the questions slightly below him and changed the subject to something about the Falcons' offensive line. I hadn't pushed. Imani seemed unconcerned. I told myself I was projecting professional suspicion onto a personal situation. That was my first mistake, and I've owned it fully in the time since. The second red flag came 8 months before the call, when Imani mentioned, again almost in passing, that Darnell had asked her to sign some account reallocation paperwork that she hadn't read carefully because he'd explained it was routine. My stomach had moved then, not dramatically, but genuinely. I'd asked if she'd had someone look at it. She'd said Darnell had said it was straightforward, that an attorney had reviewed it. I'd let it go. That was my second mistake. I did not make a third. Kofi Mensah's preliminary report arrived 3 weeks after I retained him. Hami, a 29-page document that I read at my kitchen table over 4 hours with a legal pad beside me. What it revealed was not a single act of financial aggression, but a carefully constructed architecture of asset concealment that had been in development for at least 22 months. The $340,000 transfer Imani had discovered was not the first. It was the largest visible move in a sequence of smaller relocations, totaling approximately $580,000 across multiple transactions, that Darnell had executed through a layered structure involving 2 shell LLCs and a management account registered in Delaware. The LLCs, one called Wexford Advisory Group, the other listed simply as DW Capital Partners, had been opened 14 and 19 months ago, respectively. Imani's name appeared nowhere in either entity. Darnell's appeared only obliquely, through a registered agent service in Wilmington. Kofi had also found something that made the entire picture considerably more pointed. Wexford Advisory Group had received consulting fee payments totaling $88,000 from a company called Valthorn Capital over the same 22-month window. Valthorn Capital was a mid-sized private equity firm based in Atlanta. Its CEO was a man named Reginald Thorpe. I knew Reginald Thorpe. Not well, but well enough for the name to mean something. Well enough that when I read it in Kofi's report, I put the pen down and sat very still for a moment and thought about what it meant that Darnell had been receiving payments from a firm whose CEO I had history with. Reginald Thorpe and I had crossed paths twice in my years at Grayridge Capital. The first time was at an industry conference in 2009, where we'd been on the same panel and had a lunch afterward that was cordial if unmemorable. The second time was in 2014, or when Grayridge had been on the opposing side of a deal that Thorpe's previous firm was trying to close, and I had, with thorough and entirely legitimate documentation, identified a set of valuation irregularities in their target company that had caused the deal to collapse. Thorpe had lost a significant commission. He had been professionally gracious about it in public, and, I had been told through mutual contacts, considerably less gracious in private. We had not spoken since. Now, I mention this not because I believed Thorpe had conspired with my son-in-law out of some lingering professional grudge. The world of finance is not a soap opera, but because the connection between them was not coincidental, and understanding its nature was essential to understanding what Darnell had actually been doing with Valthorn Capital's money. Kofi's investigation suggested that Darnell, who worked as a commercial real estate broker and had no prior relationship with private equity, or had been introduced to Thorpe through a mutual contact approximately 2 years ago and had been serving, in Kofi's clinical language, as a referral conduit and informal information broker for Valthorn's deal sourcing. Whether that relationship was entirely legal was a question I decided to let someone with more specific expertise address. I called a former colleague named Dwight Asare, who had left Grayridge Capital 4 years before I did, and was now a senior partner at a regulatory consulting firm that worked with the SEC and FINRA on financial misconduct investigations. Dwight had the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from 30 years of watching people find creative ways to violate regulations, and then watching the regulators catch them. I explained the Valthorn connection, the consulting payments, the LLC structure, and the asset concealment pattern. Dwight was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Walter, if what you're describing is accurate, the Valthorn payments to Darnell's LLC may constitute undisclosed compensation in connection with real estate referrals that touched Valthorn's investment activities. Depending on how those referrals were structured, you could be looking at something FINRA would find interesting." He paused. Do you want me to make a call?" I told him I wanted to understand the full picture before making any calls that couldn't be unmade. He said, "Fair. But Walter, how long has Thorpe known your daughter was married to this guy?" I told him approximately 2 years, based on the timeline. Dwight exhaled. He either didn't know who her father was, or he knew and didn't think it mattered. I told him Darnell was the kind of man who managed information carefully, parceling out details strategically, while when that it was entirely possible, Thorpe had never connected the dots between Darnell's wife and the Walter Adeyemi Burgess from the 2014 deal. "Well," Dwight said, with the dry amusement of someone who has watched irony operate in financial markets for decades, "that's going to be an interesting moment when he figures it out." The crisis point arrived on a Thursday morning in late November, 7 weeks after Imani's parking lot call. Lorraine had filed the dissipation complaint and a motion to freeze the identifiable marital assets, which the court had granted on an emergency basis, but Darnell's attorney, a man named Curtis Ellerby, who had been in family law for 18 years and was good enough at it to be genuinely dangerous, had filed a countermotion arguing that the accounts in question were legitimately separated business assets predating the marriage, and therefore not subject to marital property claims. The argument was creative and wrong, but it was the kind of creative wrong that required careful dismantling, and Lorraine told me on the phone that morning that Ellerby had also managed to identify a procedural gap in the emergency freeze that could allow certain accounts to become accessible again within 48 hours if we didn't respond precisely. "We need their financial documentation subpoenaed before that window closes," she said. Her voice was even, but the pace of her speech was faster than usual, which I had learned to read as her version of urgency. "I filed the subpoena request, but if Ellerby moves to quash it this afternoon, we have a problem. And Walter, I'm hearing through channels that Darnell is trying to get Valthorn to reclassify those consulting payments retroactively, as gifts, between friends." My hands tightened on the phone. Retroactive reclassification. Not illegal on its face. But in the context of an active marital asset dispute, it was exactly the kind of document manipulation that courts tended to view poorly when they found out about it. And they would find out about it because Kofi had already documented the original transaction records. There was a second piece of news that arrived the same morning, from a different direction. Imani called me at 9:45 a.m., voice steady in the way that people are steady when they've decided to be, to tell me that Darnell had contacted her directly, in violation of the informal no-contact arrangement Lorraine had established, and told her that if she pushed forward with the legal action, he would countersue for what he described as financial misrepresentation during the marriage, a claim so vague it could mean almost anything and almost certainly meant nothing specific, but was designed to sound threatening. He had also told her, This was the detail that tightened something in my chest, that her father was a retired old man playing lawyer, and that she should think carefully about whether she wanted to let him handle this. I let Imani finish. I told her she was handling this with Lorraine, and that Lorraine was formidable, and that the retired old man comment was something Darnell was going to have an opportunity to reflect on in the near future. Imani almost laughed. Almost. I told her I loved her, and I'd call her that evening. Then I called Kofi and asked him if he had enough to present to Valthorn directly, in a way that would make the nature of their exposure very clear. Kofi said he had enough for a comprehensive presentation. I said, "Set it up. I want a meeting." The meeting at Valethorn Capital was arranged through a contact of Dwight's who knew Thorpe's chief operating officer, a woman named Philippa Crane, who had 20 years of institutional finance experience and who, when she received a summary of what we had, through channels that Dwight navigated carefully, agreed to a meeting within 4 days. The meeting was framed from Valthorn's side as an opportunity to discuss a regulatory matter of mutual concern. From my side, it was an opportunity to make something very clear to Reginald Thorpe about the situation his firm had funded, knowingly or otherwise. I did not inform Darnell about the meeting. Lorraine did not inform Curtis Ellerby. The only person on my side who knew the full scope of what I planned to present was Kofi, who would be sitting beside me with the documentation, and Lorraine, who had reviewed everything for legal exposure, and had told me, with the particular satisfaction of a litigator who sees the pieces assembling correctly, that she couldn't think of a better play. What none of us had anticipated, what added the final layer to a situation that already had enough layers, was that Darnell himself would be at the Valthorn offices that morning. He'd scheduled a separate meeting with Thorpe, apparently also related to the retroactive reclassification he was trying to arrange. We arrived in the same lobby within 12 minutes of each other. He saw me at the reception desk, and his expression did something I'd never seen it do before in 4 years of Sunday dinners and holidays and the accumulated ordinary moments of being family. It went genuinely uncertain. Not guilty, not afraid exactly, just uncertain. The face of a man who is suddenly not sure what room he's walked into. We were shown to the same conference room. This had not been planned by me, and I believe it had not been planned by Valthorn either. It appeared to be a scheduling overlap that nobody had caught, which said something about how quickly things had moved and how many different currents were crossing in the same water. Darnell was already seated when Kofi and I came in. He looked at me. He looked at Kofi. Then he leaned toward his own attorney. Ellerby was not present. Darnell had brought a younger associate from the same firm whose name I never learned, and said something low and fast. Then he did it. The laugh. That quiet, nasal exhale. The half-dismissal of a man who has decided to perform confidence because the alternative is admitting he doesn't feel any. I sat down across from him and I put my folder on the table, and I said nothing. The door opened. Reginald Thorpe came in with Philippa Crane and Valthorn's general counsel, a man named Obina Nwosu, who held a J.D. from Georgetown and had 12 years in securities law. Thorpe was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, the polished gravitas of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this one. He scanned the table as he walked to his seat. He looked at Darnell, whom he clearly recognized. He looked at Kofi. Then he looked at me. And I watched the recognition travel across his face the way recognition does when it arrives from memory rather than introduction. Not the sharp surprise of someone seeing a stranger do the unexpected, but the slower, more complex recognition of someone realizing that a face they know belongs to a situation they hadn't understood. He stopped walking. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then, "Wait, is that who I think it is?" His general counsel looked at him. Philippa Crane looked at him. And Darnell looked between us, confusion crossing his face for the first time that morning, genuine confusion rather than performed uncertainty. And I looked at Reginald Thorpe, and I said evenly, "Hello, Reg. It's been a while." What followed in the next 90 minutes was not a confrontation exactly. It was a presentation. Kofi laid the documentation on the table in the organized, methodical sequence he'd rehearsed. The LLC structure, the transaction timeline, the consulting payments, the chronology of the marital asset transfers, the dates on which certain Valethorn-connected referrals had occurred, and the proximity of those dates to the internal financial movements in Darnell and Imani's joint accounts. Obina Nwosu reviewed each exhibit with the focused attention of a man calculating legal exposure in real time. Philippa Crane made notes and stopped making notes and made notes again. Thorpe sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing for 40 minutes, in which was information in itself. The Reginald Thorpe I remembered from 2014 had been someone who talked through uncertainty rather than sitting inside it. The silence meant he was thinking carefully, which meant he understood what he was looking at. Darnell, across from me, had stopped performing anything. His associate attorney was visibly out of his depth and had the specific stillness of someone trying to make himself smaller without physically moving. At one point, Kofi placed a document that showed the dates of 3 property referrals that had passed through Darnell's informal network to Valthorn, cross-referenced with the corresponding consulting payment deposits into the DW Capital Partners LLC account. Obinanwosu looked up from it and said to no one in particular, "These payments were disclosed to compliance as relationship management fees?" Thorpe said carefully, "That was my understanding." Obinanwosu said nothing further, but he set the document to one side in a way that communicated it had joined a different pile. I spoke once during Kofi's presentation, and it was not to Darnell. I waited until Kofi had completed the section on the Wexford Advisory Group LLC and the retroactive reclassification attempt, and then I looked at Thorpe and said, "Reggie, I want to be clear about what I'm here to accomplish. I'm not here to create a regulatory problem for Valthorn. I'm here because your firm has been a financial instrument in my son-in-law's attempt to conceal marital assets from my daughter, knowingly or otherwise, and I need that to stop. The documentation in front of you tells a story. What story your compliance team would like that to tell is something you'll need to decide in the next few days." Thorpe looked at me for a moment. And then he said, "You said knowingly or otherwise." I said, "I did." He said, "I genuinely did not know he was your daughter's husband. I don't know that it changes the legal analysis, but I want you to know it." I looked at him and assessed this and decided it was probably true. Thorpe was many things, but the kind of man who would knowingly antagonize a former adversary through a family member was a different kind of adversary than he'd ever shown himself to be. "I believe you," I said. "Which is why we're talking, rather than letting Dwight Asare's colleagues handle the introduction." Obinanwosu's head came up slightly at Dwight's name. Thorpe's expression shifted in a way I recognized from 20 years of watching people calculate whether they were more exposed by fighting or by cooperating. He said, "What do you need from us?" I told him exactly what I needed. The process that followed was methodical and, for the most part, conducted through attorneys rather than directly. Hunter Valthorn's legal team, under considerable internal pressure from what Obinanwosu had found when he actually examined the compliance documentation around the consulting payments, provided Lorraine with a full record of all transactions between Valthorn and DW Capital Partners LLC across the entire 22-month window. They also provided a written statement clarifying that the payments had been made as professional fees for referral services, not as gifts or personal transfers, directly contradicting the retroactive reclassification that Darnell had been attempting to arrange. That statement became Exhibit F in Lorraine's filing. Kofi's full investigative report, properly formatted and with supporting documentation, became Exhibits A through E. The court received everything within 9 days of the Valthorn meeting. Curtis Ellerby, reviewing the filing, apparently called Lorraine and used language she declined to repeat to me, but summarized as colorful. He also, within the same week, had a conversation with Darnell that I was not party to, but whose outcome I was informed of 4 days later, when Ellerby contacted Lorraine and indicated that his client wished to discuss the parameters of a settlement. The settlement negotiation took 3 weeks and was conducted entirely through attorneys, which was appropriate and which I respected even when it required patience I had to work to maintain. The final terms were favorable in the ways that mattered. The $340,000 in the identified transfer account was returned to the marital asset pool for equitable distribution. The full $580,000 in trace transfers, minus amounts that Lorraine and Ellerby negotiated through a complex back and forth I will not fully reconstruct here, resulted in Imani receiving a settlement significantly in excess of what she would have received through standard equitable distribution had the concealment succeeded. The DW Capital Partners and Wexford Advisory Group LLCS were dissolved as part of the agreement, with full documentation provided to Lorraine confirming the dissolution filings. Darnell retained his personal accounts and a portion of his real estate commission's pipeline. He did not retain the narrative he had apparently constructed, in which his wife was a passive participant in her own financial life who wouldn't notice. He and her father was a retired old man with no remaining relevance to rooms like the ones Darnell frequented. That narrative was gone. Completely. The Valthorn matter was referred to their compliance department for internal review, and Dwight Asare's firm received an inquiry from FINRA 3 months later that had nothing to do with me directly, but which I was informed of through channels and which I understood to be the institutional consequence of what Kofi's report had documented. I did not initiate that inquiry. I did not need to. Documented irregularities have a bureaucratic gravity of their own. Imani and I had dinner at my house the Saturday after the settlement was signed. She made her mother's jollof rice, the version with the smoked fish that takes 2 hours and requires a particular patience with the heat. And we ate at the kitchen table with the windows open and the late November air coming through, and we talked about almost everything except the settlement for the first hour. She talked about her plans, about the apartment she was looking at in Buckhead, about a professional opportunity she'd been hesitant to pursue while the marriage was collapsing, but which now felt possible. She looked tired in a way that was starting to lift, the tiredness of someone who has been carrying a weight long enough that the removal of it takes time to register in the body. At one point, she put her fork down and looked at me with the directness she'd had since she was 8 years old, the directness I'd always loved about her, and said, "Dad, how long have you been planning this?" I told her I'd started planning it the night of her parking lot call. She said, "How did you know Thorpe would respond the way he did?" I told her I hadn't known for certain, but that I'd understood that Val Thorne's legal exposure was real, and that real exposure, when properly presented to competent counsel, tends to produce cooperative behavior. She said, "The retired old man?" I said, "The retired old man." She smiled. It was the first full smile I'd seen from her in 3 months, and it looked like my wife, and which is not a detail I will share with anyone who wasn't at that dinner table. 3 months later, Darnell listed the house for sale and accepted an offer within 2 weeks. Imani was in her new apartment by then, building something that was hers in ways the previous 4 years hadn't quite managed to be. I spoke to Lorraine once more, in January, when she called to inform me that Curtis Ellerby had reached out regarding a procedural question about the dissolution documents, and to tell me, in the tone of a woman who does not give compliments casually, that in 26 years, she had not had a client who arrived at the first meeting with documentation as organized as mine. I told her it was 31 years of professional habit and a legal pad, and a very long night. She said, whatever it was, it worked. I called Kofi and thanked him properly. I called Dwight and told him the matter was resolved. As he said, "Did Thorpe ever figure out that you'd been thinking about that 2014 deal the whole time?" I told him I genuinely hadn't been, that the 2014 deal had been professional business and this was personal business, and I was capable of keeping the two categories separate. Dwight said, "Sure you were." I let that go. The garden needed attention, and I had a book I'd been meaning to finish since October. The retired old man had some things to get back to. What I think about, when I let myself think about all of it, is the laugh. That quiet, contained exhalation. The decision to dismiss me as irrelevant before I'd opened the folder or said a word. I spent 31 years watching people make that calculation in conference rooms. The rapid assessment of who matters and who doesn't. The hierarchy of attention. The way a well-dressed man in his 30s sometimes looks at a quieter, to older man in a department store blazer and decides he already knows what he's dealing with. Darnell looked at me and saw the category of person he thought I was. He didn't look long enough, or carefully enough, or with enough genuine curiosity to see anything else. That was his error. Not the financial scheme, not the LLC structure, not the retroactive reclassification attempt. All of those were errors too, but they were the downstream consequences of the first one. From the first one was deciding he knew who I was before he'd paid the kind of attention that knowing actually requires. I sat across from him in that conference room and let him laugh. I let him settle into his certainty. I let him believe, for the few minutes before Reginald Thorpe walked through the door, that he understood the room he was in. He hadn't understood it from the moment I sat down. He just didn't know that yet.